With graphics like that, this guy must work out.
Hello folks, coming to you from a job I'm doing. I am building an office inside of a church. And we're just putting wooden studs up. Most commercial buildings have metal studs, but I just bid this job out to do wooden. It's easier to get, and they were fine with that. The big challenge here usually is making sure your ceiling height most of the time is at least 9, sometimes 10 foot. These are 9, and I brought them up to 112. The part you got to figure out is it'll make your job easier when you go to finishing, is measuring off how far you need to cut your trim back. If you get that measurement just right, remember your studs are 3.5, you got to have a 1/2 inch of drywall on both sides. Usually figure roughly 5 inches for your wall. So I cut that. I measured out what I needed and cut it on both sides. So hopefully when I get done, all I'll have to do is put this finish trim right there, which goes against the wall along the edge of the new wall on both sides. And this trim piece will just sit right in there, and then all I'll have to do is just cut the pieces of drop ceiling to drop back in. Figuring it out is usually the toughest part. Building the wall doesn't take any time. Just put them on 16-inch centers. It's not required here because this is a carpeted floor that I'm going over the top, but it's a good practice to always use a treated bottom board. That way any moisture that comes up through the floor, concrete, especially if you're doing this on a slab, make sure your bottom board is treated. Really, it's a good practice to do it anywhere. Even if you're doing a wooden frame house, your bottom board needs to be treated. That gives you some protection. That way, if you do get water intrusion, at least you're covered up to 1.5 inches before it gets to anything that's going to really destroy and cost you a lot of money. So I'll kind of take you through this project. It's a 10-foot wall. I've got an outlet I got to put in the middle of this wall, and on commercial it's always in metal conduit, so I'm going to put a metal box here and then route a conduit up through the top, and then the electrician's going to pull the wire through. Ductwork will have to be rerun, and then I've got a 12-foot wall going on this side with a doorway over here, so I have to have a switch outlet. And then they want a 4-gang box and a single-gang box, one for cable and one for electrical here. So I'll give you a little more details as I start throwing up the walls. Since I made it 112, that's the total overall height of the wall. You figure 1.5 inches for your header and 1.5 inches for your bottom, which gives you 3. So these boards were all cut to 109, which gives me an overall height of 112. So just remember that when you're cutting. They do sell studs. I don't know, there's not too many places that carry 10-foot studs or 9-foot studs, which is what a lot of residential buildings are going with now. But I know for a fact they carry 8-foot studs, which are usually 92 and 5/8, somewhere around that number. So they go ahead and cut off the pieces for your top and bottom. And also it kind of acts as a mini header. You usually do 2 boards at the top. That helps tie all the walls in. You overlap them on top of one another. So when this wall came in, I would make them to where they stack on top of one another to kind of help brace the 2 in. And it gives you some weight for your ceiling joist to set on. But since this is not having any weight on it whatsoever, I don't have to put in a double header. But when you build a wall for anything else, you need to have two headers on the very top, and then just one treated board on the bottom. So and you just lay your board out, and your tape measure is going to have markings on it for your stud placement. If you didn't know, those red numbers are 16s. So you lay your tape measure out, put your mark at 16, 32. This is off because my marking's off over there. 4 foot, 64, and so on. So your tape measure, all your red numbers are your stud placement, if you didn't know that. So just mark those out, and all you got to do is just tack it in, 2 nails on the bottom, 2 nails on the top, then just set the wall up. And I'm going to get some concrete anchors and anchor it into the cinder block over here. And I'll be using anchors that'll go into the mortar joints. It's a good practice, especially on cinder block. Don't run your anchors into the block itself. Put them into the mortar joints. There's a lot more strength in your mortar joints. Sometimes you'll crack the block, and you'll have a really hard time getting your anchor to hold in the cinder block. If you've ever seen one, it's hollow inside, so make sure you run your anchors into your mortar joints. All right, thanks. All right, folks, I now have this wall stood up. I had to stick frame this wall here because there wasn't enough room in here with the space I have to stand this up and not risk dropping this entire drop ceiling. Plus the ductwork was in the way. So when I do that, I try to get at least the base plate, and this is called the top plate, not the header. I messed it up on the other video. But try to get one of them full. So I put a full bottom plate in. Remember, this is treated. And then I spliced in the top plate. I didn't have another 12-foot 2x4, so I used a 2x4x10, and then just spliced a piece in. Then I left these couple studs out in the middle, stood the wall up. Another thing I forgot to go over is putting in a doorway. So when you're putting in a doorway, you need to know what size door you're putting in. So if you're putting in, you add 2 inches to your width and 1 inch to your height when you're installing a door. So if it's a 36-inch door, you need to make sure that your opening is 38 inches and your standard height on a door is like 81.5, I think. So usually make it about 82 and a half, your opening, which will give you plenty of room to slide your door in. Now you leave this bottom piece in. So one of the last things you do with framing, you always leave your openings, your doorways, leave your base plate in, get everything up almost right up to the point that you're going to hang drywall and you're totally done with framing. Then you come in with a Sawzall and cut these out. But until then, you leave it all as one piece. That keeps the frame from twisting on you. So when you're putting these together, you got to have a jack, which is what this is. That's what your header sets on. And this is called a king stud. So your king studs are going to go outside of your opening. And your header sets 1.5 inches in. So for this example, you're setting on 38 inches wide, which is how wide this is from my inside of my jack stud to the other inside of my jack stud. I've got jack studs that take up 3 inches and then another 1.5 inches on each side, or another 3 inches for my king studs. You usually try to set at least one of your king studs, make it part of your standard framing. So if they're on 16 centers, you try to put your doorway next to one of those. Now of course this, in order to keep up 16 centers, I do have a stud here just due to the spacing. So that spacing there is going to be different. Just depends on where you're going to put your door. If they wanted this door in the middle, my king studs could have been anywhere, but I tried to use one of the standard wall studs has that. These top boards are called cripples. This is your header. It's a 2x4. I'm using a 2x6. Most standard houses framing using a 2x8. Could even use something bigger depending on how tall your ceilings are. And then another 2x4 on the top. They're nailed together. So I'll show you how you build that. This is just an example. This is all 2x4s. But your 2x4 is 3.5 inches wide. You got 1.5 inches and 1.5 inches. So of course you're going to have a 1/2 inch play. You leave that in the center. So when you're nailing this, say this was my header, I'll shoot my nail in here, here, and here. If you look on the other side, I shoot it in here, here, and here. And that's going to leave an opening in the center of the header. That's fine. It doesn't hurt anything. Some people will put in a 1/2 inch piece of plywood in between here. That'll add some strength, but most all headers are built this way. So you'll nail in the top. That'll get it looking like a U. Flip it all over. And I'm not nailing this, of course, but when you flip it over, it'll look like that. You set this on top, nail it, and that is how your header will look when you're done. So that's just a short example of what it looks like. So that is how you build it. You space that out. Like I said, it depends on how wide your door opening is as to how that looks. You put your cripples at the top. You leave these on your 16-inch centers because your drywall needs to be able to hit on a 16. No matter where your king studs are, you want your wall studs to continue to go 16 centers because that's what you're going to base your drywall installation on. So after I do that, I went around and put these, since this is on a concrete slab, I used a concrete nail gun to hammer these in. As you go about every other opening, I'll put a concrete nail in. And the way that works, if you haven't seen one of these, they make many different kinds. I use a DeWalt, but it's basically shooting a 22 blank. So put your nail in first, just squeeze it in. You can buy some of these that have rings. And then they have different gauges of shot. I usually go with a 4. It just depends on what you're going into. The lower the load, like a 1, 2, or 3, that's the softer the material that you're putting it in. Just remember, if you're using it on a really soft material and you got to use a heavy load, it's possible that you'll drive the nail all the way through. And they do make these with washers on them. So then you put your nail in, or put your load in. Make sure that that seats all the way down in there, like so. And all you have to do with this one is sit it down, hold it down, and then take a hammer and smack this right here. That shoots the 22 load, which pushes the nail into the board and into the concrete. So that's how I put all these in, put them up the cinder block wall. Remember, put your nails on your mortar joints. If you put it in the center of the cinder block, you're just going to crack it out and possibly have more work to do. So don't do that. I also had to frame in the opening over here. Other than that, I've got to put in my conduit, my electrical conduit, put in my boxes, and start hanging sheetrock tomorrow. Then I'll be ready to start tying the ceiling back in and get it all tied up. But I want to give you a little heads up on framing the walls. Another thing you need to think about is nailers, which is all this is. You can waste a whole stud. I don't usually. If you're looking at this wall, and think about it, when you lay a surface, lay a material on it, the drywall, you have to have something to nail to. So the way this is built, unless you put something here to nail to, your drywall is going to hang over here and you won't have anything to nail to. So that's all this is just a nailer for this drywall. This over here won't need one. Inside a residential house, if you're putting in ceiling drywall, this is doing a drop ceiling, you would put a 2x6 or a 2x8 across the top over your double header. That way your ceiling drywall has something to screw into. But since we're not doing that, we're just using drop ceiling. I don't need to do that here, but that's kind of the last step, is going through and making sure that after you get everything framed, that you've got nailers in every spot. And you're doing a whole house. That's the tough part, is remembering where all of them are, you know, because every little nook and cranny, little closets and stuff, making sure all your ceilings have something to tie to. It's a pretty important step. So hope this video helps. Thanks.
This guy needs to be a poster child for birth control. If you like that video, hit subscribe.